By the fire's glow, the truth is always revealed. Welcome to the Fireside Casebook.
The rain in Loch Dhu did not fall so much as it drifted, a fine grey haar that clung to the heather and turned the peat bogs into treacherous sponges. It was the kind of morning that invited a man to stay by the fire with a stout pot of coffee and a thick slice of black pudding. PC Hamish Macbeth, however, was currently crouched behind a jagged outcrop of rock near the mouth of the Annex River. He was not there on official police business. In fact, he was pointedly ignoring the muffled chirping of his radio inside his salt-stained Land Rover, parked half a mile up the track. Hamish was engaged in his favourite pastime, poaching. With a flick of his wrist, he cast a line into the churning grey water. He was a tall, lanky man with a shock of unruly red hair and eyes the colour of a Highland loch, sometimes green, sometimes gold, always watchful. Beside him, his dog Lugs, a creature of uncertain pedigree with ears that seemed to belong to two different animals, sat perfectly still. Lugs knew the rules of poaching as well as his master. Silence was the difference between a salmon dinner and a lecture from the fishery warden. "Almost there, Lugs," Hamish whispered, his voice a soft, melodic Highland burr. "A beauty, 5 pounds if she's an ounce." Just as the line tightened, the peace was shattered. It wasn't the police radio or the cry of a gull. It was the aggressive, high-pitched whine of a high-performance engine echoing off the glen walls. A sleek silver SUV, far too clean for the Sutherland mud, roared onto the verge, spraying gravel across the moss. Hamish sighed, expertly cutting his line and tucking his rod into a hollowed-out log. The salmon was gone, and work, it seemed, had arrived. The arrival of the Sassenach out of the vehicle stepped a man who looked like he had been curated for a country-living photo shoot in London. He wore a crisp, quilted Barber jacket that had clearly never seen a day of actual weather, and leather boots that shone with a city polish. This was Julian Vane, a retired London art dealer who had recently purchased the Crag, a Victorian hunting lodge overlooking the bay. "You there, constable!" Vane shouted, waving a gloved hand as if hailing a taxi in Piccadilly. Hamish stood up slowly, unfolding his long limbs with a deceptive lethargy. He put on his simple Highlander face, a look of vacant, polite bewilderment that had frustrated many a superior officer. "Good morning to you, Mr. Vane," Hamish said, tipping his cap. "A bit damp for a stroll, is it no? Damp?" "It's a deluge," Vane snapped, marching toward him. "And I've had quite enough of the local charm, Macbeth. Someone has been dumping refuse near my property line, crates of stinking fish guts. I expect you to finger the culprit immediately." Hamish looked at the man's reddening face. Julian Vane had been in Loch Dhu for 3 weeks and had already managed to alienate the postmistress, threatened to sue the local pub over the noise of a Saturday night fiddle session, and demand that the sheep be moved because their bleating interfered with his yoga. "Mr. Vane," Hamish said softly, "the wind has a way of moving things about in the Highlands. Perhaps it was just the gulls." "Don't give me that simpleton routine," Vane sneered, leaning in. He smelled of expensive cologne and old money. "I know how you people operate. You're all in it together, protecting your own. I'm paying a fortune in taxes for this peace, and I won't have it ruined by some disgruntled crofter with a grudge." Hamish watched a bead of rain drip from the end of Vane's nose. He thought about the salmon he had lost, and the warm coffee he wasn't drinking. He also thought about how Julian Vane was the kind of man who didn't realise that in a small village like Loch Dhu, silence was a luxury and privacy was a myth. "I'll look into it, Mr. Vane," Hamish promised, his voice devoid of any real urgency. "In the meantime, you might want to watch your step. The rocks around here can be slippery." Vane gave a dismissive grunt and turned on his heel, heading back to his silver fortress. As the SUV roared away, Lugs let out a low, mournful growl. "I agree, Lugs," Hamish muttered, reaching for his discarded rod. A man like that makes a lot of noise. And in Loch Dhu, noise is usually followed by a very loud silence. He didn't know yet how right he was. But as he looked up at the darkened windows of the crag silhouetted against the stormy sky, Hamish Macbeth felt a familiar prickle of unease. The peace of the village was about to be broken, and it wouldn't be by fish guts. The following morning did not bring the sun. Instead, it brought a thick, claustrophobic fog that the Highlanders called a pea souper. It muffled the sound of the waves and turned the pine trees into ghostly sentinels. Hamish Macbeth was in his kitchen, the small stone-walled heart of the police station, nursing a mug of coffee that was more chicory than bean. He was wearing an old, moth-eaten Fair Isle jumper that had seen better decades and a pair of trousers that were dangerously thin at the knees. He was just contemplating the merits of a second fried egg when the telephone on the wall began to shrill. Hamish eyed it with deep suspicion. In Loch Dhu, a phone call before 8 in the morning never heralded a win on the football pools. It usually meant a sheep had wandered onto the road. Or, worse, a tourist had managed to get themselves stuck on a ledge while trying to photograph a stag. Loch Dhu Police Station, PC Macbeth speaking. He sighed into the receiver. Hamish, it's Archie McLean. You've got to come up to the crag. Quick like. The voice on the other end was high-pitched and trembling. Archie was a local handyman whose primary skills involved leaning against fences and knowing exactly who was buying more whiskey than they could afford. Calm down, Archie. Has Mr. Vane found another pile of fish guts? No, Hamish. It's Mr. Hamish. He's in the cage, and I don't think he's breathing. Hamish felt a sharp pinch of annoyance. He had been looking forward to a morning of administrative duties, which mostly involved staring out the window and thinking about his next meal. What cage, Archie? What are you talking about? The big iron one, the art piece he had delivered from London last week. Just come, Hamish. It's gay fearsome. Hamish hung up, grabbed his salt-encrusted cap and whistled for Lugs. The dog, sensing the lack of breakfast in his immediate future, gave a low whine, but followed his master out into the damp chill. The drive up to the crag was a slow crawl through the white void of the fog. When Hamish arrived, he found Archie McLean standing by the entrance of the driveway, his face the colour of old porridge. He was pointing toward the centre of the manicured lawn, where Julian Vane had recently cleared away ancient hardy gorse to make room for a sculpture garden. In the centre of the lawn stood a large, ornate Victorian birdcage, nearly 7 feet tall, made of heavy black-painted wrought iron. It was a ridiculous, pretentious thing, meant to be a conversation piece. Now it was a tomb. Julian Vane was inside. He was dressed in a pair of flamboyant gold silk pyjamas and a matching dressing gown. He was slumped against the bars, his head tilted back at an unnatural angle. His mouth was open in a silent, indignant O, and his skin had taken on the waxy, bluish hue of a landed trout. But the most striking thing, and the detail that made Hamish's dark Highland humour twitch, was that the cage was padlocked from the outside with a heavy modern brass lock. "Is he dead, Hamish?" Archie whispered, hovering several feet away. Hamish stepped closer, his boots squelching in the expensive sod. He peered through the bars. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn silk, just a wealthy Sassenach in a cage, looking like a very expensive, very dead canary. "Aye, Archie. He's dead as a salted herring," Hamish said, his voice flat. He didn't touch the lock. He didn't need to. He stood there for a moment, hands shoved deep into his pockets, observing. He noticed that Vane's bare feet were remarkably clean for someone who had allegedly walked across a muddy lawn in the middle of the night to get into a cage. He also noticed a faint, lingering scent in the damp air, something that didn't belong in the Highlands. It wasn't the smell of the sea or the peat. It was the sharp, antiseptic tang of peppermint. "Right," Hamish muttered to Lugs, who was sniffing the base of the cage with deep disapproval. "That's my week ruined, then." He looked at the body of the man who had been so full of arrogance and bile only 24 hours ago. Vane had wanted privacy, and now he was trapped in the most public, humiliating way possible. "Go back to the village, Archie," Hamish commanded, his policeman voice finally emerging. "Tell Mrs. Kennedy to get off the phone so I can call Strathbane, and tell her if I hear a whisper of this in the grocery shop before I've even had my breakfast, I'll be looking very closely at her nephew's lack of a driving licence." Archie scrambled away, glad for an excuse to leave the scene. Hamish sighed and leaned against his Land Rover, staring at the cage. He knew what was coming. DCI Blair would arrive screaming and spraying spittle, convinced that some local savage had murdered the Londoner for his gold watch. The piece of Loch Dhu was officially shattered. He reached into his pocket, found a crumpled peppermint sweet and popped it into his mouth. The taste matched the scent in the air. "Well, Julian," Hamish whispered to the corpse, "you wanted to change the Highlands. It looks like the Highlands decided to change you instead." The sound of a distant, aggressive siren began to wail through the fog, signalling the end of Hamish's solitude and the beginning of a very long, very loud headache. The peace of the glen was not merely broken, it was shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces by the arrival of the Strathbane police. 3 white and blue patrol cars, their sirens screaming like banshees in the mist, tore up the driveway of the crag, followed by a nondescript black sedan that Hamish knew all too well. It was the vehicle of Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a man whose blood pressure was a matter of local legend and whose hatred for Hamish Macbeth was the only thing more consistent than the Scottish rain. Blair exploded from the car before it had even come to a full stop. He was a thick-set man with a face like a slapped ham and a suit that struggled to contain a belly fueled by years of pub lunches and bitterness. Behind him trailed his usual shadows, Detectives Anderson and McLean, who looked like they had been dressed by a bargain bin tailor with a grudge. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice echoing off the iron bars of the birdcage. "What in the name of the great glen have you done now? Why is there a dead Sassenach in a canary cage? And why are you standing there looking like a derelict shepherd?" Hamish tipped his cap, his expression carefully blank. "Good morning to you, sir. It's a sad business. This is Mr. Julian Vane. Archie McLean found him this morning." Blair marched over to the cage, his shoes sinking into the expensive lawn with a satisfying squelch. He stared at the corpse of Vane, who still looked remarkably indignant, even in death. Blair's eyes didn't linger on the clean feet or the odd scent of peppermint. They went straight to the heavy brass padlock. Locked from the outside, Blair muttered, a predatory gleam entering his small, watery eyes. A clear-cut case of murder. Some local savage with a resentment for the English has decided to make a statement. Probably over a boundary dispute or a poached salmon. He turned a piercing, accusatory glare on Hamish. "Where were you at 3 a.m., Macbeth? Out stealing the king's fish again?" "I was in my bed, sir," Hamish said mildly. "With Lugs. He can testify to it, though his Gaelic is a bit rusty." "Don't you get smart with me, you ginger-haired peasant." Blair's face deepened from pink to a dangerous shade of purple. "Look at this. The victim is humiliated. This is the work of a small-minded, vindictive local. Someone with a grudge. Someone like that handyman of yours. What's his name? McLean? Archie found the body, sir," Hamish pointed out. "He's a nervous man. He wouldn't have the stomach to lock a man in a cage to die, let alone the wit to get Mr. Vane into it without a struggle." "Nonsense," Blair snapped. He was already composing the press release in his head. DCI Blair solves macabre Highland murder in record time. McLean is a shiftless drunk. He probably came up here to rob the place. Vane caught him, and McLean shoved him in the cage. It's obvious. Anderson, get McLean into the back of the car. I want him in an interview room in Strathbane before lunch." "But, sir," Hamish intervened, his voice soft but persistent, "if you look at the victim's feet, they're clean. If he'd walked across this mud in the middle of the night, Even in his slippers, they'd be filthy. He was carried here, or he was already in the cage when it was moved. Blair stepped closer to Hamish, his breath a foul mixture of stale tobacco and peppermint humbugs. "Listen to me, Macbeth. You are a village bobby. Your job is to tell people where the post office is and occasionally find a lost cat. You are not a detective. You are a glorified traffic warden in a bad jumper. I am the DCI. I see a lock, I see a local with a motive, and I see a closed case." He leaned in further, his voice dropping to a hiss. "If I hear one more theory from you, I'll have you transferred to the harshest beat in Glasgow so fast your kilt will spin. You're lucky I don't arrest you for obstructing the scene with that mangy cur of yours." Lugs let out a low, vibrating growl at the word mangy. Hamish placed a calming hand on the dog's head. "As you wish, sir," Hamish said, adopting his most submissive Highland drawl. "I'll just stay out of the way then. Would you like me to fetch you some tea from the hotel? The wind is a bit sharp today." "I don't want your tea, I want results." Blair turned back to the cage, shouting orders at the forensics team who were just beginning to unpack their kits. "And get that cage open. I want to see if he's got his wallet on him. These locals always go for the wallet." Hamish watched as the Strathbane team swarmed the lawn, trampling potential evidence and shouting at each other. They were looking for fingerprints and DNA, for high-tech solutions to a very human problem. They didn't notice the way the grass was flattened in a specific trail toward the back of the lodge, nor did they care about the psychological state of a man who would choose a birdcage as a murder weapon. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish whispered. "We're not wanted here. Let's go see what the village has to say about our poor canary." As he walked away, Hamish felt a familiar spark of quiet defiance. Blair would bully Archie MacLean until the poor man confessed to being the second coming of Jack the Ripper, but the truth was still out there, hidden in the whispers of Lochdu, and Hamish Macbeth was the only one who knew how to listen. The village of Lochdu sat huddled around the curve of the sea loch, like a group of old women sharing a secret. By the time Hamish reached the main street, the canary in the cage news had already travelled faster than a Highland gale. Faces peered from behind lace curtains, and the usual morning lethargy had been replaced by a sharp electric tension. Hamish's first stop was not the scene of the crime, nor the police station, but the village stores and post office. Mrs. Kennedy, a woman whose nose for scandal was more acute than a bloodhound's for foxes, was already holding court behind the counter. "A terrible thing, Hamish," she said, though her eyes sparkled with the grim excitement that only a local murder can provide. And Archie MacLean in the back of a police car. The poor soul wouldn't hurt a fly, even if the fly owed him for a week's work. "Aye, it's a business, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish said, leaning casually against the counter. He looked down at a tray of fresh scones. "Those look remarkably light this morning. A man can't think on an empty stomach, and with the DCI shouting enough to wake the K-Leech, my nerves are quite frayed." Mrs. Kennedy sighed, a sound of practised martyrdom, and placed 2 scones on a paper plate. "On the house, Hamish, just this once. Now what is that man Blair thinking arresting Archie?" Hamish took a slow, deliberate bite of a scone, closing his eyes as if the flavour were his only concern. "The DCI likes a quick answer, Mrs. Kennedy. He doesn't care if it's the right one. Tell me, did Mr. Vane have many visitors up at the crag? He seemed a lonely sort of man for all his money." "Lonely? Ha!" Mrs. Kennedy leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He was a predator, Hamish. He didn't come here for the scenery. He was buying up troubled debts. He'd find out who was behind on their mortgage or their taxes, buy the debt from the banks and then squeeze them. He wanted the land, you see, wanted to turn the whole hillside into a private sculpture park for his fancy London friends." Hamish paused, a crumb of scone caught in his red beard. Did he now? And who was he squeezing particularly hard? "Well, Mrs. Kennedy checked the door to ensure no other customers were within earshot. He had a right set to with the minister last week. and I saw Nellie Grant coming out of there in tears on Tuesday, but the one who was there most was that young fellow Peter, who works at the curry shop, delivering food, he said, but he was there at all hours, and he didn't always have a bag of pakoras with him. Hamish nodded thoughtfully. He moved from the post office to the Lochdu curry house. The smell of turmeric and cumin was a strange, vibrant contrast to the damp peat of the village. The owner, Mr. Patel, was a man Hamish liked, mostly because Mr. Patel understood the value of a quiet life and a free meal for the local law enforcement. "Ah, Hamish," Mr. Patel greeted him. "A dark day. Is it true? The Englishman died in a cage?" "It is. Tell me, Mr. Patel, your boy Peter, was he a friend of Mr. Vane?" Mr. Patel's face clouded. "Peter is a good boy, but he is impressionable. Vane told him he had an eye for art. He had Peter moving things for him, heavy things. Said he would pay for Peter to go to school in Edinburgh. But Peter's been jumpy lately, crying at night." "And would Peter happen to have a fondness for peppermints?" Hamish asked, his gaze drifting to a glass jar of extra strong mints on the counter. "He eats them by the pound," Mr. Patel sighed. "Says they help his indigestion. Why?" "Just a thought," Hamish murmured. He stood up, his lazy demeanour masking a mind that was now firing rapidly. He spent the next hour mooching his way through the village. He shared a dram of whiskey with Geordie, the local poacher, who confirmed that someone had been moving a large, heavy object toward the crag 2 nights ago under the cover of the Ha. He had a cup of weak tea with the minister, who admitted that Vane had threatened to evict the church-run youth centre over a technicality in the deed. By the time the rain began to turn into a steady, rhythmic downpour, Hamish had a very different picture of Julian Vane than the one DCI Blair was painting. Vane hadn't been killed by a local savage in a fit of pique. He had been systematically dismantling the lives of the people of Lochdu, one debt and one secret at a time. He was a man who collected people's weaknesses, and someone had finally decided that the collector belonged behind bars, literally. As Hamish walked back toward the station, Lugs trotting dismally at his heels, he saw Priscilla Halberton Smythe's sleek Rover parked near the hotel. Priscilla, cool, blonde, and far too wealthy for a simple policeman, was often the only person who could bridge the gap between Hamish's world and the world of the Sassenachs. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish said, straightening his cap. "Time to see what the upper classes have to say about our dead canary. And maybe, if we're lucky, she'll offer us a proper lunch." The Tommel Castle Hotel was a sprawling, baronial pile of grey stone that looked as though it had been designed to withstand a Viking invasion rather than host tourists. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of floor wax, wood smoke, and the expensive perfume of people who didn't have to worry about the price of coal. Hamish shook his wet cap outside the heavy oak doors, sending a spray of Highland rain across the heraldic rug. He found Priscilla Halberton Smythe in the residence lounge, seated by a roaring fire that Hamish immediately envied. She was as cool and elegant as a winter morning, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, a contrast to Hamish's own damp ginger disarray. "Hamish," she said, her voice like silk over gravel, "I heard about the incident at the crag. Poor Julian. Or perhaps I should say poor Lochdu. The village is buzzing like a disturbed hive." "Aye, Priscilla. It's a mess," Hamish said, lowering himself into a velvet armchair that felt entirely too soft for a man of his station. Lugs flopped at his feet, his wet fur beginning to steam near the hearth. "Blair has Archie MacLean in the cells, and he's currently trying to fit a square peg of a motive into a very round hole." Priscilla set down her teacup with a delicate clink. "Archie? That's ridiculous. Archie hasn't the imagination for such a theatrical murder. Julian was many things, but he wasn't simple. He was a collector of more than just art, Hamish. So Mrs. Kennedy tells me. She says he was buying up debts. Priscilla leaned forward, her eyes darkening. It was more than that. Julian had a black museum back in London. He didn't just want land, he wanted leverage. He delighted in finding the cracks in people's reputations. He called it social curation. He told me once at a dinner party that every stately home in the Highlands had a skeleton in the closet, and he intended to assemble the whole graveyard. Hamish felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. Was he looking at the Halberton Smythes? Priscilla gave a small, bitter smile. My father is a bore, Hamish, but he's an honest one. No, Julian was interested in the new arrivals, the ones trying to hide where their money came from. But there was someone else, a woman, Lady Jane Winterton. She's staying at the hotel, though she's been indisposed since the news broke. Hamish perked up. Lady Jane? The one with the face like a tired hawk? The very one. She was Julian's patron for years. But I saw them arguing on the pier 2 days ago. Julian was laughing, that high, thin laugh of his, and she looked as though she wanted to push him into the loch. She kept saying something about a bird in a gilded cage. Hamish's mind leapt back to the lawn at the crag. A gilded cage. It was too poetic to be a coincidence. And there's one more thing, Hamish, Priscilla added, her voice dropping as a waiter passed by with a tray of drinks. The birdcage itself. Julian didn't buy it. Took it as collateral from the minister's sister, Elspeth, when her husband's gambling debts became public. It's an heirloom. Elspeth was devastated. She told me it was like he was stealing her family's soul. Hamish sighed, rubbing his face. The lazy village he loved was suddenly teeming with people who had very good reasons to want Julian Vane silenced and humiliated. You've been very helpful, Priscilla, Hamish said, standing up. His stomach gave a traitorous growl, echoing in the quiet lounge. Priscilla smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through her aristocratic reserve. Sit down, Hamish. I've already ordered you a plate of roast beef and a pint of bitter. You can't solve the village's problems if you're fainting from hunger. I shouldn't, Hamish started, then caught the scent of the gravy wafting from the kitchen. Well, perhaps just a small plate, for the sake of the investigation. As he ate, Hamish watched Priscilla. She was his sounding board, the person who saw the world from the top down while he saw it from the bottom up. Between them they saw the whole ugly picture. Hamish, she said softly as he finished. Be careful. Blair is looking for a scapegoat. The person who put Julian in that cage didn't just want him dead. They wanted him to look foolish. That kind of hatred doesn't stop with one lock. Hamish nodded, his mind drifting back to the scent of peppermint and the clean feet of a dead man. The social dynamics of the upper class were as treacherous as the bogs on the moor. Vane had been playing a game with people's lives, but he had forgotten that even a bird in a cage can peck. I'll be careful, Priscilla, Hamish promised, reaching for his cap. But I fear the DCI is about to make a very loud mistake, and I'll have to be the one to pick up the pieces without him noticing I've done it. The usual Macbeth manoeuvre? She teased. The only way to stay in Loch Dhu, he replied with a wink. The air inside the tiny Loch Dhu police station was thick with the smell of damp wool and DCI Blair's cheap tobacco. Blair was currently leaning over a trembling Peter from the curry shop, his face so close that he was practically shouting into the boy's ear. "We found it, you little scoundrel," Blair bellowed, slamming a small evidence bag onto the scarred wooden desk. Inside was a single white chalky disc, a peppermint. A peppermint! Right there, caught in the grass beside that iron cage. And what do we find in your pockets, boy? A whole tin of them. You and that drunk McLean thought you were clever, didn't you? Shoving the posh Londoner into his own birdhouse because he threatened your little delivery scam. Peter was weeping openly now, his thin shoulders shaking. I didn't, I swear. I was home all night. I only go to the crag to bring the lamboona. Mr. Vane, he liked his curry extra hot, he did. Likely story, Blair sneered, turning to Anderson and McLean, who were leaning against the wall looking bored. He's cracking. Another hour and he'll give us the whole thing. He carried the body and Archie provided the muscle and the lock. It's a classic local conspiracy. Hamish Macbeth was sitting in the corner, ostensibly busy with a tangled ball of fishing twine, though his ears were tuned to every word. He looked at the peppermint in the bag, then at the dog, Lugs, who was sitting near Peter. Lugs was a dog of great discernment, and currently he was resting his chin on Peter's shoe, his tail thumping rhythmically. "Excuse me, sir," Hamish said, his voice a soft apologetic drawl that made Blair's eye twitch. "What is it now, Macbeth? Can't you see I'm conducting a high-level interrogation? It's just about the peppermint, sir. You see, Peter there, he only eats the extra strong variety, the ones with the blue speckles. He gets them from Mr. Patel's shop by the bucket load." Blair glanced at the bag. The mint inside was pure, snowy white. "So?" "A mint is a mint. He probably bought a different brand to try and throw us off the scent. He's a criminal mastermind, this one." Hamish stood up slowly, his tall frame nearly reaching the low ceiling. "Well, that's just it, sir. That mint in the bag, that's a Highland Cloud brand. They only sell those at the Tommel Castle Hotel. They put them on the pillows for the guests. Peter here has never stepped foot in the Tommel Castle, except maybe to drop a takeaway at the back door, and even then he's not getting the pillow treats." Blair's face darkened. He could have stolen it, or found it. "And there's the matter of Buster," Hamish continued, gesturing toward the door where Peter's aging border collie was tied up. "Buster is a fine dog, but he has a terrible allergy to peppermint. If Peter so much as opens a tin within 10 feet of him, that dog starts sneezing like a steam engine. I've seen it happen at the shop. But look at Buster now. He's been sitting with Peter for 20 minutes and hasn't so much as sniffed." Blair looked at the dog, then at Peter, then back at the mint. "Are you telling me my star piece of evidence is a pillow mint?" "I'm saying, sir, that someone wanted us to find a peppermint, someone who knew Peter's habit. But they were a bit too posh to know which brand the boy actually buys. They used what they had in their pocket, a mint from the hotel." Blair let out a sound like a kettle boiling over. "I don't care about your dog logic, Macbeth. We have a motive. We have the lock. I'll find the link if I have to sweat this boy until Christmas." "But, sir," Hamish added, moving toward the evidence board where Blair had pinned a photo of the victim's feet, "there's a button missing from Mr. Vane's pyjama top, a gold-threaded one. Forensic didn't find it in the cage, and they didn't find it on the lawn. If Peter and Archie had wrestled him into that cage, that button would be in the mud. But the feet were clean, remember? He wasn't wrestled. He was invited." Blair froze. The missing button was a detail he had overlooked in his rush to blame the savages. He hated when Hamish noticed the small things. It made his own big-picture detective work look like the blustering of a fool. "Get out," Blair hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "Get out of my sight, Macbeth. Take your dog and your Highland clouds and go play in the rain. I'm keeping the boy here until I say otherwise." Hamish tipped his cap, a small, knowing glint in his eye. He had done what he needed to do. He had planted the seed of doubt in Blair's mind, and more importantly, he had confirmed his own suspicion. As he stepped out into the misty street, the rain felt cool against his face. The obvious suspect was a red herring, a carefully constructed trap for a man like Blair who hunted with a sledgehammer. The real killer was someone who stayed at the Tommel Castle, someone who knew Peter S. habits, and someone who possessed a very specific kind of cold, calculated irony. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish whispered. "The DCI is chasing ghosts. Let's go see if we can find where that gold button went. I have a feeling it's sitting in a very elegant pocket." The investigation was no longer about a bird in a cage. It was about the person who had handed Julian Vane the key and told him it was a palace. Hamish Macbeth did not return to the police station. Experience had taught him that when DCI Blair was in a state, the safest place for a village constable was anywhere else. Instead, he took the long path through the pine woods toward the Tommel Castle Hotel, his mind turning over the pieces of the puzzle like a man sorting through a basket of tangled fishing line. The rain had eased into a persistent, melancholy drizzle that made the trees look like they were weeping. Hamish stopped by the hotel's kitchen entrance, a place where he was always welcome due to his ability to fix the head chef's temperamental radio and his willingness to listen to the staff's endless complaints about the quality of the guests. "Hamish," whispered Jessie, a young maid with eyes that saw everything and a tongue that wagged even faster than Mrs. Kennedy's. She handed him a thick sandwich of cold ham and mustard. "The Hawk is in a right state today. Lady Jane, she's had us running up and down the stairs for hot water bottles and chamomile tea as if she's the Queen of Sheba herself. Is that so, Jessie?" Hamish leaned against the damp stone wall, taking a large, appreciative bite of the sandwich. "And has she been indisposed since the news of Mr. Vane broke? Or was she already feeling the vapours yesterday?" Jessie looked around cautiously. "She was fine until the police cars arrived. But I'll tell you something odd, Hamish. Yesterday morning, before the fog rolled in, I went to clear her room. She was burning papers in the grate. In this weather. The room was like a furnace. And she was crying, not sad crying, but the sort of angry crying my mother does when she's found out the cat sicked up on the good rug." Hamish chewed slowly. "Burning papers, you say? And did you happen to see what was on them?" "Only a scrap that fell on the hearth," Jessie said, her voice dropping. "It was a photograph, an old one, black and white. It showed a young woman. Looked a bit like her ladyship, but dressed in a common police uniform. Not a fancy one, mind you, a prison matron's outfit." Hamish felt the gears of the mystery finally find their teeth. The social curation Priscilla had mentioned wasn't just a hobby for Julian Vane, it was a weapon. Vane hadn't been interested in Lady Jane's friendship. He had been holding her past over her head like a guillotine. He finished his sandwich and made his way to the hotel's main lounge, where he found Lady Jane Winterton sitting by the window, staring out at the grey expanse of the loch. Up close, her face was a map of hard lines and desperate pride. She wore a heavy tweed suit and a string of pearls that looked tight enough to choke her. "Lady Jane," Hamish said, removing his cap and adopting his most deferential, soft-spoken Highland manner. "I'm sorry to disturb your peace. I'm PC Macbeth. I believe you were a close friend of Mr. Vane?" Lady Jane didn't look at him. "Friend? One does not have friends like Julian Vane, Constable. One has associations. He was a deeply unpleasant man who delighted in the misfortunes of others. Is that why you were arguing with him on the pier 2 days ago?" She stiffened, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her handbag. "I was merely telling him that his presence in Loch Dhu was unwelcome. He was a parasite feeding on the history of better people. He was also a man who kept things," Hamish said, his voice as gentle as the rain. "Things like old photographs or records of people's lives before they became ladyships." For a second, the mask slipped. Lady Jane's eyes flashed with a cold, murderous terror. She looked at Hamish, and for the first time, she didn't see a useful peasant. She saw a threat. "I don't know what you're implying, Constable," she hissed. "But if you continue this line of questioning, I shall speak to your superiors in Strathbane. I believe DCI Blair is a man of much higher calibre than a common village policeman." "Oh, he is that, my lady," Hamish agreed, his smile not reaching his eyes. "He's a man who loves a big, obvious clue, like a peppermint on a lawn, or a missing gold button." He let his gaze wander down to her handbag. Poking out from the side of the clasp was a tiny, glinting thread of gold, the same thread he had seen on the victim's silk pyjamas. It was a trophy, he realized, or perhaps a souvenir of the moment she had locked the cage and watched the man who knew her secret realize he was finally the one being curated. The motive wasn't money, it wasn't land, it was the preservation of a lie. To a woman like Lady Jane, who had spent 40 years building a life out of stolen status, the truth was a death sentence. Julian Vane hadn't just been a neighbour, he had been the jailer of her past. "I'll leave you to your tea then," Hamish said, tipping his cap again. "But the wind is picking up, my lady. It has a way of blowing away the fog and showing us what's been hidden in the grass. As he walked away, he felt her eyes boring into his back. He had the motive, and he had the who. But he also knew that Lady Jane Winterton was a woman of immense influence. If he tried to arrest her now, Blair would have him in a cell before the handcuffs were even clicked. He needed a trap. He needed to make her move first. "Come on, Lugs," he muttered as they stepped back out into the rain. "We need to go find Archie and Peter, and then we need to do a little bit of curating of our own." The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke, turning the streets of Lochdu into rivulets of peat-stained water. Inside the police station, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. DCI Blair was pacing the small room like a caged tiger. Ironically enough, while Peter sat slumped in a chair, his eyes red-rimmed from hours of circular questioning. Hamish entered, shaking his dripping oilskins. He looked particularly dishevelled, even for him. He had a piece of seaweed stuck to his boot and an expression of vacant, mild-mannered defeat. "Still at it, sir?" Hamish asked, leaning against the doorframe. "You're a man of great stamina, to be sure. Most men would have stopped for a pie by now." "Shut up, Macbeth," Blair barked, slamming his hand onto a stack of folders. "The boy is stonewalling, but I've called for the transport. They're taking him and McLean to Strathbane tonight. I'm wrapping this up." "Aye, well, it's a shame," Hamish said with a heavy sigh, "especially with the Glasgow boys coming up tomorrow." Blair stopped mid-pace. "Glasgow? What are you talking about? Oh, I thought you knew, sir." Hamish scratched his head, looking confused. "Since it's a high-profile case involving a Londoner, the Chief Constable has authorised a sweep with the new high-density metal detectors. They're looking for that missing gold button from the victim's pyjamas. Apparently those buttons are quite unique, hand-struck gold with a family crest. If they find it in the mud where someone was standing, it's as good as a fingerprint." Blair's eyes widened. A gold button with a crest was exactly the kind of glamour evidence that made for a front-page photograph. "They're coming tomorrow?" Blair demanded. "First light, sir. I told the hotel staff to clear a path. I even mentioned it to Lady Jane and the others in the lounge, so they wouldn't be alarmed by the specialist equipment. I told them the detectors are so sensitive they can find a speck of gold through 6 inches of solid peat." Hamish watched the gears turn in Blair's small, ambitious mind. If Blair could find that button tonight, before the Glasgow team arrived, the glory would be his alone. "And where," Blair said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl, "did your intuition suggest this button might be, Macbeth?" "Well, sir, if I were a betting man, which I am not, the Kirk being what it is, I'd say it's near the back entrance of the lodge, where the grass is all trampled. But then, I'm just a village bobby. I'm probably wrong." "You're usually wrong," Blair snapped, grabbing his coat. "Anderson, McLean, we're going back to the crag. I want a line sweep of that lawn. Now." As the Strathbane team scrambled out into the rain, leaving the station momentarily empty, Hamish turned to Peter. "Go home, Peter. Tell Mr. Patel I'll be by for those pakoras later, and tell Archie to go home too. The DCI has a new bone to chew on." "But Hamish," Peter stammered, "the button, is it really there?" "In a manner of speaking," Hamish murmured. Once the boy was gone, Hamish whistled for Lugs. He didn't go to the crag. Instead, he walked back to the Tommel Castle Hotel. He didn't go inside. He moved around to the side of the building, near the heavy Victorian laundry chutes that led to the basement. He knew the psychology of a woman like Lady Jane. She was a creature of control and status. The mention of a specialist team and a gold crest would be intolerable to her. She wouldn't be able to sleep knowing that a single piece of thread or a stray button could dismantle 40 years of aristocratic artifice. She would want to ensure that whatever evidence she still held, the button she had likely pulled off in a moment of vengeful triumph, was gone forever. Hamish crouched in the lee of a stone wall, the rain drumming a steady rhythm on his cap. "Now, lugs," he whispered. "We wait. A woman like that won't throw something so precious into the loch where it might wash up. She'll want it destroyed. And the hotel's old coal-fired boiler is the only place in Loch Dhu hot enough to melt gold." The village clock struck 10, the sound muffled by the ha. For a long time there was nothing but the wind. Then a side door of the hotel creaked open. A tall, shrouded figure emerged, wrapped in a dark cloak that seemed to swallow the light. The figure moved with a hurried, jerky grace toward the basement stairs. Hamish didn't move yet. He waited until he heard the heavy iron door of the boiler room groan on its hinges. "She's taken the bait," Hamish said, his voice tinged with a rare sadness. "It's a terrible thing, lugs, when the past comes calling and find you've no way to pay the bill." He stood up, his joints protesting the damp, and began to follow the shadow into the heat of the cellar. He wasn't looking for a promotion, and he certainly wasn't looking for a fight. He just wanted his village back, and to do that, he had to confront the hawk in her nest. The basement of the Tommel Castle Hotel was a labyrinth of low-hanging pipes, soot-stained brick, and the rhythmic guttural roar of the massive coal-fired boiler. It was a hellish contrast to the refined elegance of the drawing rooms above. The air was thick with the smell of sulphur and ancient dust, vibrating with the sheer force of the furnace that kept the aristocratic guests in their accustomed warmth. Hamish Macbeth stepped into the boiler room, lugs close at his heels, his paws clicking softly on the stone floor. He saw the shadow first, a tall, jagged silhouette cast against the glowing orange cracks of the furnace door. Lady Jane Winterton stood before the boiler, her expensive tweed cloak discarded on a coal heap. She looked like a different woman. Her hair was coming loose from its pins, and her face, illuminated by the firelight, was a mask of desperate, frantic intensity. In her hand she held a small velvet-lined box and a bundle of yellowed papers. "It's a hot night for a fire, my lady," Hamish said. His voice was steady, cutting through the mechanical roar of the boiler. Lady Jane spun around, a gasp escaping her throat. She looked at Hamish, then at the dog, her eyes wide and glittering with a feverish light. "You! What are you doing down here, Macbeth?" "This is a private area." "Private as a bird cage, I suppose," Hamish replied, stepping into the light. He looked remarkably calm, his hands resting easily at his sides though his muscles were coiled. "I think you have something that doesn't belong to you. Or perhaps it belongs to you too much. I don't know what you're talking about," she hissed, her voice cracking. "Get out of here, you pathetic little man. I'll have you sacked for this." "You won't," Hamish said softly. "Because there are no metal detectors coming tomorrow, Lady Jane. There is no Glasgow team. There's just me and the fact that you're down here at midnight trying to melt down a gold button that matches the ones on a dead man's pyjamas." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hiss of steam. Lady Jane's face crumpled, the aristocratic veneer finally shattering to reveal the terrified woman underneath. "He was going to ruin me," she whispered, her voice trembling with a lifetime of suppressed rage. 40 years, Macbeth. 40 years I've been Lady Jane. I've done the charities, I've hosted the galas, I've buried the truth of where I came from. I was a matron in a women's prison in Holloway. That's where I met my husband. He was a visitor, a widower. He never knew the truth of my common past, and I never told anyone. But Julian found out. He always found out." She held up the velvet box. "He mocked me. He called me his special exhibit. He told me he was going to publish his memoirs and include the photograph of me in my uniform. He said the Highlands needed a good laugh." "So you decided to give them one instead," Hamish said. "You drugged his evening tea." Those peppermints were a clever touch to hide the taste of the sedative, weren't they? And you had Peter move that cage for you earlier in the week under the guise of art placement. You probably told Julian it was a surprise, a gift. You led him out there, sleepy and confused, and you locked him in. A poetic end for a man who loved to collect people. He deserved it, she shrieked, her voice rising above the roar of the fire. He was a monster. Suddenly she lunged toward the open furnace door, her arm swinging to hurl the box and the papers into the white-hot heart of the fire. Hamish moved with the speed that would have stunned DCI Blair. For all his lazy Highland ways, Hamish was a man of the hills, lean and deceptively strong. He caught her wrist mid-air, his fingers like iron bands. "I can't let you do that, my lady," he grunted. Lady Jane turned into a whirlwind of desperate, aristocratic fury. She clawed at his face with her free hand, her nails drawing blood across his cheek. She was surprisingly strong, fueled by the prospect of total ruin. They struggled in the cramped, scorching space, stumbling against the coal shovel. "Lugs, watch it!" Hamish shouted as the dog darted in, barking furiously and nipping at the hem of Lady Jane's skirt, distracting her just long enough for Hamish to pin her against the brick wall. With a sharp twist, he forced her to drop the velvet box. It clattered onto the stone floor, the lid popping open to reveal the glinting gold button and the old black-and-white photograph of a stern young woman in a prison matron's cap. Lady Jane collapsed then, her strength deserting her all at once. She sank to her knees among the coal dust, sobbing, not for Julian Vane, but for the death of the woman she had spent 4 decades pretending to be. Hamish stood over her, breathing hard, a thin line of blood trickling down his face. He picked up the box and tucked it into his pocket. He felt no triumph, only a weary sadness. "The truth is a heavy thing to carry, my lady," he said, his voice returning to its soft Highland burr, "especially when you've been running from it for so long." He reached for his radio to call for backup, but paused. He looked at the broken woman on the floor and then at the roaring boiler. He knew that in a few minutes the silence of the night would be replaced by the sirens of Strathbane. DCI Blair would arrive, screaming for blood and glory, and the quiet life of Lochdu would be a memory for a long time to come. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish sighed, wiping the blood from his cheek. "Let's get this over with. I have a pot of stew at home that's probably burnt to a cinder by now." The sound of tyres screaming on the wet gravel of the Tommel Castle Hotel entrance signalled the arrival of DCI Blair. He burst into the boiler room 10 minutes later, followed by Anderson and McLean, who both looked like they had been dragged through a peat bog backwards. Blair's face was no longer just red. It had reached a shade of alarming, bruised purple that suggested his collar was about to explode. "Macbeth!" he roared, the sound echoing off the copper pipes. "I've spent 2 hours in a force 10 gale searching for a button that doesn't exist. If I find out you've been playing me for a fool, I'll have you directing traffic in the middle of the M8. Hamish stood up slowly from a wooden crate, looking every bit the weary, soot-stained village constable. He had Lady Jane sitting on a chair in the corner, her head bowed, looking like a ghost in the dim light. The velvet box sat open on the table between them. "Oh, thank goodness you're here, sir," Hamish said, his voice thick with a fake breathless relief. "Your plan worked perfectly, just as you predicted." Blair stopped mid-rant, his eyes narrowing. "My plan? Which plan would that be?" "The metal detectors, sir," Hamish exclaimed, widening his eyes in feigned admiration. "When you told me to go about the village, and the hotel mentioned that high-density sweep you'd ordered from Glasgow, I thought you were just trying to stir the pot. But you knew, didn't you? You knew the pressure would make the real killer panic." Blair blinked. He looked at Lady Jane, then at the glinting gold button in the box, and finally at the old photograph of the prison matron. He puffed out his chest, the anger being rapidly replaced by a greedy, opportunistic gleam. "Of course I knew, Macbeth," Blair blustered, adjusting his tie and trying to look authoritative despite the mud on his chin. "Psychological warfare. That's the modern way. I knew if I stayed visible at the crag, the suspect would feel the net closing in and try to dispose of the evidence. It was brilliant, sir, Hamish continued, leaning in as if sharing a secret. I was just doing my rounds as you instructed, keeping an eye on the low probability areas when I saw her ladyship sneaking down here with these items. If it weren't for your brilliant deduction about the missing button, I'd never have known what she was carrying. Blair stepped forward, shoving Hamish aside with a meaty shoulder. He picked up the gold button, turning it over in his fingers. A gold crest, just as I suspected, and this photo, blackmail fodder, a classic motive of social preservation. I've seen it 100 times in the big city. He turned to Lady Jane, his voice booming with the practiced gravel of a man who loved the sound of his own authority. Lady Jane Winterton, I am arresting you for the murder of Julian Vane. You have the right to remain silent. As Blair droned on with the formal caution, McLean and Anderson began to usher the broken woman toward the stairs. Blair paused, looking back at Hamish, who was currently patting lugs and looking like he was about to fall asleep. And Macbeth? Yes, sir. Don't think this means you're getting a commendation. You nearly bungled the whole thing by letting her get this close to the boiler. If I hadn't timed my arrival perfectly, the evidence would have been ash. You're a lucky man that my strategy was so foolproof. I know, sir, Hamish said humbly. I'm just a simple village policeman. I'm better off with the sheep than with high-level psychological warfare. I'm just glad the credit for this one will go to the proper place, the Strathbane CID. Blair gave a short, satisfied grunt. Too right. I'll be writing the report tonight. I'll make sure to mention that you assisted in the final containment. But honestly, Macbeth, you lack the drive for real detective work. You'll be lucky to keep this post after the mess you made of the initial scene. I'll try to do better, Sir Hamish promised. His head bowed. As the Strathbane team marched their prize out into the night, Hamish watched them go with a sense of immense, quiet satisfaction. He knew exactly how the report would read. DCI Blair's innovative use of psychological pressure and strategic deployment leads to the arrest of high-profile murderer. There would be no promotion for Hamish Macbeth, no transfer to the smog and noise of Glasgow, no medals that would require him to wear a suit and sit behind a desk. He had successfully remained useless in the eyes of the law, which was the only way he could remain useful to the people of Loch Dhu. He reached into his pocket and found one last peppermint, a Highland cloud from the hotel. He popped it into his mouth, the sharp, clean taste cutting through the soot and sulphur of the basement. "Come on, Lugs," he whispered, the dog's tail thumping against his leg. "The big men have their glory, and we have the peace and quiet. I think we got the better end of the bargain, don't you?" Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the clouds were parting to reveal a sliver of Highland moon over the loch. The canary had been silenced, the hawk had been caged, and for one more night, the village of Loch Dhu belonged to the man who knew how to listen. The morning after the arrest of Lady Jane Winterton, Loch Dhu was bathed in a rare golden clarity. The storm had washed the sky clean, leaving the mountains looking as if they had been painted in sharp oils of purple and green. The loch was a sheet of glass, disturbed only by the occasional ripple of a rising trout. Hamish Macbeth sat on the bench outside the police station, a chipped mug of coffee in his hand and the sun warming his face. To any passing tourist, he looked like the very picture of Highland indolence. A man whose greatest ambition for the day was to avoid moving. Lugs lay at his feet, belly up, basking in the warmth. The dog was currently ignoring a large ginger tomcat that was perched precariously on the station wall. The peace was near absolute, save for the distant rhythmic thwack of Archie McLean's axe as he chopped wood, a free man once more, and remarkably sober after his ordeal in the Strathbane cells. Hamish Macbeth. The peace was momentarily punctured by Mrs. Kennedy, who was bustling across the street from the post office, her apron fluttering like a battle flag. She was clutching a copy of the Strathbane Gazette. "Have you seen it? The hero of the Highlands, they're calling him." She thrust the paper under Hamish's nose. The front page featured a large, grainy photograph of DCI Blair. He was standing on the steps of the police headquarters, chest puffed out so far his buttons looked under genuine duress. The headline screamed, "Lady in the Cage, DCI Blair's brilliant trap snaps shut." "It says here," Mrs. Kennedy read aloud, her voice dripping with local skepticism, "that through a series of calculated maneuvers and deep psychological profiling, the detective chief inspector lured the killer into a basement to catch her red-handed. It barely mentions you at all, Hamish. Just says a local constable provided security at the scene." Hamish took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes twinkling. "Well, Mrs. Kennedy, the DCI is a man of great education and high-level training. It's only right he gets the credit for such a sophisticated operation. I'm just glad it's over. I've a lot of filing to do, you know." Mrs. Kennedy snorted. "Filing? The only thing you'll be filing today is a hook into a salmon's mouth, I'll wager. But it's a shame, Hamish. You're a better man than that blustering blowhard from the city. I'm a man who likes his own bed and a quiet village, Mrs. Kennedy. If I were a hero, they'd have me living in a flat in Glasgow with nothing but the smell of exhaust and the sound of sirens for company. I think I've the better part of the deal." She shook her head, though a fond smile touched her lips. "You're a deep one, Macbeth. A deep one." As she wandered back to her shop, the village returned to its gentle rhythm. Later that afternoon, a sleek silver rover pulled up by the station. Priscilla Halberton Smythe stepped out, looking radiant in a cream-coloured silk blouse and tailored trousers. She carried a small basket covered with a linen cloth. "I brought you some of the chef's special venison pie," she said, leaning against the doorframe of the station, "and a bottle of something Father said was too good for a common bobby, which is why I made sure to take it." "You're a treasure, Priscilla," Hamish said, his voice softening. "The village is quiet again," she observed, looking out over the bay. "The crag is already back on the market. They say Julian Vane's estate is in a shambles, and Lady Jane, well, the lawyers are already arguing about her diminished responsibility due to the stress of the blackmail." "It doesn't change what she did," Hamish said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But she was right about one thing. Vane was a collector. He collected the worst parts of people and kept them in his own little museum. In the end, he became his own final exhibit. And you, Hamish? Are you happy with how it ended?" Hamish looked at his dog, then at the smoking chimney of his small stone house, and finally at the mountains that had seen 1,000 such dramas come and go. "The sun is out, the coffee is warm, and the DCI thinks I'm the biggest fool in the Highlands," Hamish replied with a slow, contented grin. "I couldn't be happier." Priscilla laughed, a sound like silver bells, and kissed him lightly on the cheek before heading back to her car. "Don't ever change, Hamish Macbeth. Lochdu wouldn't know what to do with a proper policeman." As the evening began to draw in, casting long, indigo shadows across the glen, Hamish went inside to light his stove. The smell of the venison pie soon filled the air, mingling with the scent of peat smoke. He sat by the window, watching the first star blink into existence over the Annex River. He thought briefly of the gold button sitting in an evidence locker in Strathbane, and of the photograph of a young woman who had once wanted to change the world but ended up trying to hide from it. Then he reached for his fishing rod, checked the line, and whistled for lugs. The salmon would be jumping in the moonlight, and for PC Hamish Macbeth, that was the only law that truly mattered tonight. The moon hung over Lochdu like a silver sickle, casting a cold, brilliant light across the ripples of the bay. The village was finally, truly silent. The sirens had faded into memory, the reporters had retreated to their city desks, and the restless spirit of Julian Vane had been safely filed away in the archives of the Strathbane CID. Hamish Macbeth was not in bed. He was standing on the small stone pier, his long silhouette mirrored in the dark water. Lugs was a shadow at his side, his nose twitching at the scent of salt and drying seaweed. Hamish held a small flat stone in his hand, turning it over and over. "You see, Lugs," he whispered, "the problem with secrets is that they're like the tide. You can build all the walls you want, but the water always finds the cracks. Lady Jane spent 40 years building a dam, and Vane just happened to be the one who poked a hole in it." He tossed the stone. It skipped 3 times, zip, 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 before vanishing into the blackness. "Hamish, is that you lurking in the dark like a kelpie?" The voice belonged to Geordie, the local poacher, who appeared from behind a stack of lobster creels. He was carrying a suspicious-looking sack that smelled strongly of river water and fresh scales. "It is, Geordie, and I see you're out for a midnight stroll yourself." Geordie shifted the sack, his weathered face breaking into a grin that revealed more gaps than teeth. "I heard the big man Blair was on the television this evening, looking like a prize bull at the Inverness Mott. Said he solved the whole thing with his unmatched intellect." "Aye, he's a man of many talents," Hamish said mildly, "one of which is believing his own lies." "The village knows, Hamish," Geordie said, his voice dropping to a gravelly seriousness. "We know it was you who saw the gold thread. We know it was you who kept the boy Peter from the cells. Lochdu has a long memory for those who look after their own. Lochdu has a long memory for everything, Geordie. That's the blessing and the curse of the place." Geordie reached into his sack and produced a magnificent silver-bright salmon. He held it out toward Hamish. "A gift, for the security you provided. I'd hate for a man of the law to go hungry while the criminals in Strathbane are eating steak on the taxpayer's shilling." Hamish eyed the fish. It was a beauty, easily £6 and certainly taken from the protected pools of the annex. "I should arrest you, Geordie. Poaching is a serious offence." "Is it now?" Geordie asked, his eyes twinkling. "I didn't see a fish. I just saw a friend standing in the dark who looked like he needed a good supper." Hamish reached out and took the salmon. "Suppose my eyesight isn't what it used to be in this moonlight. I didn't see a thing either." As Geordie vanished back into the shadows of the village, Hamish walked slowly back toward the police station. He felt a deep, marrow-deep tiredness, the kind that only comes when the mask of the lazy policeman has been held in place for too long. He entered his small kitchen, the stove still radiating a gentle, comforting heat. He cleaned the salmon with practiced, efficient strokes, the scales glinting like coins under the low light of the oil lamp. He thought about the birdcage at the crag. It would likely be sold to another collector, someone who saw only the Victorian craftsmanship and not the lingering scent of peppermint and fear. People love to own things, Hamish mused, but they never realized that the things they owned eventually ended up owning them. He fried a thick steak of the salmon in butter, the sizzle a cheerful sound in the quiet room. He shared a small portion with Lugs, who ate it with the solemn dignity of a dog, who knew he had earned his keep. As he ate, Hamish looked at the empty chair across from him. His life was a solitary one, punctuated by the occasional brilliance of Priscilla or the sharp-tongued company of the villagers. He was a man caught between two worlds, the ancient, silent Highlands and the loud, impatient world of the Sassenachs. But as he sat there, with the peat fire glowing and his belly full, he knew he wouldn't trade his small kingdom for all the gold buttons in London. He stood up, blew out the lamp, and walked to the window. The village was asleep, tucked away under the shadow of the mountains. There would be no more murders tonight, no more cages, just the wind in the heather and the slow rhythmic pulse of the sea. "Good night, Lochdu," Hamish whispered. He went to bed, falling into a deep, dreamless sleep. He slept with the peace of a man who had successfully hidden his light under a bushel, ensuring that for at least another season he would be allowed to remain exactly where he belonged, the smartest, laziest, and most watchful man in the glen.